Hello, my name is Danny Bravo, and I'm here to talk to you guys about mass incarceration and the impact of minority men in the household. Ever since the 1970s, society had to develop growing concerns that minority men were being marginalized and targeted in order to push this racial rhetoric of punitive policies. What Americans fail to acknowledge, though, is that mass incarceration doesn't affect the individual. It affects other groups outside of the individual, and there has been an increase of mass incarceration of minority men over the past decade with little research about what it does to the household. The primary purpose of this review is to show you that the incarceration of minority men affects more than just beyond the scope of the individual, right? It's the household, and how has it affected over the past decade? The first of these questions is defining the scope and the impact mass incarceration has had in the past decade. Now, the second part of it is asking the impact that it has on the families and children in these households. We must then look into the emotional impact and the financial and the social, the political roles, how all those intersect. And furthermore, I believe that it is essential to see how this review is limited and the research is limited and there's gaps that need to be filled, hence my research. Now, my research question is, how has mass incarceration of minority men affected the household socially, emotionally, and obviously physically over the past decade? There have been three factors that need to be discussed when analyzing the effects of mass incarceration of men in the household. These are the social, economic, and emotional ones. The system has evolved and become a new form of racial segregation and a web of marginalization of from policing, courtrooms, jails, probation, and social control, as well as the privatization of prisons, cheap labor, and economic interests have given rise to mass incarceration. And the relevance is that by understanding and attempting to solve this research, we have a better understanding on the scope and the impact mass incarceration has. Now, my thesis is that mass incarceration of minority men has led to the failures in family structure. Now, this has a direct correlation with the social, emotional, and cognitive development of the child, as well as the financial standpoint of the partner, right? The spouse. My framework implements, therefore, a macro level theory where institutions like schools, prisons, minority culture, and society are needed and are graphed. And that is important from there because each one of those structures in society will help us answer our thesis, right? Our argument. And my arguments are that mass incarceration disrupts social networks, which leads children to higher rates of deviance and distractions in class and home. And also that it breaks up the relationship between family members, creating a strain, and that is because the criminal justice system is difficult to navigate on its own, and this relationship affects not only the individual itself, but the development of the child and the relationship between the spouse, and it creates these barriers and obstacles, right? And my last argument is that by having a father figure that's incarcerated, it comes with this label, this stigma, that social stigma, and this discrimination in society. Now, my first piece of evidence is from Table 1, and it's a operationalization, and descriptive statistics. What we can see from Table 1 is that there's people who agree that mass incarceration is an issue that needs to be addressed, and it does affect the household, right? So we see more than half the people can agree to that. We also see that uh, Table 1 also shows that most individuals agree that political climate and public opinion have influenced mass incarceration, right? So there are these factors that are affecting how many minority men we are locking up, right? These policies, these laws that go into effect. Now, continuing, this bar graph that we see here depicts the proportions of respondents who agreed and disagree with the political factors that contribute to mass incarceration, right? And we see that in question 39, right, which is deeming what do you believe that there's this rhetoric of policies that are being pushed to the American public about mass incarceration. It's saying that the majority agree that mass incarceration has been influenced by a combination of political and social policy movements. And as you can see here, the agree portion by far dominates the neither agree or the disagree, and we'll talk about that, what that signifies in the end. And my last piece of evidence actually is from table 1. It's a correlation matrix of numbers of children and age variables. Now, this is crucial, and I'll tell you why. Because table 1 gives us this insight on the correlation of matrices that takes children in the household, the number of children in the household, and the ages of the spouses, right? And it's crucial to understand how one of my independent variables and one of my dependent variables coincide with one another. The individuals with the children and the loved one in prison can be used to understand how a child's development can be affected. It's also important to note that age is a factor to understand, to help us cope and understand how people see uh, the mass incarceration and the political atmosphere, right? So as I was mentioning, one piece of evidence that I also gathered and data was that the younger people are, the more liberal views they have on mass incarceration as compared to older, right? And also the number of children does also correlate with that, right? With the more number of children, the more liberal as well. Um, and like I was just mentioning my findings, the evidence is limited, but it does show how mass incarceration of minority men affects the household socially, emotionally, and on a financial level. Research makes the argument that mass incarceration is both ineffective at reducing crime and creates unnecessary stresses or barriers, and that's obviously from the survey. We should aim to target the criminal justice system more easily, and we can see that racial identity and mass incarceration intersect more than we thought, and that most either agree or strongly agree that political factors do influence mass incarceration. Now, lastly, what does this all mean? It means that evidence is limited and mixed concerning how mass incarceration of minority men affects the household on a social, emotional, and financial level. Research makes the argument that mass incarceration is both ineffective at reducing crime and creates unnecessary stressors and barriers. We should aim to target how we should aim to target and make the criminal justice system more easier to navigate, visit, and communicate between family members. And we need to create these support systems, these safety nets that help tear down barriers in education, housing, employment, and social mobility for these men of color. And as you can clearly see, there is additional research that is needed to shed light on this issue and be publicly aware. Thank you. I appreciate it.